So the next step is going to be removing the fuel rail, and I'm going to try and remove all of the injectors at one time. There should be 4 nuts holding on the fuel rail. And I just realized I have the wrong size. Just go and crank those loose. A lot of them are already not tight, so it won't be too hard actually. A firm pull up should be able to pull all of those out and pull right out and remove the whole fuel rail as a unit. And I will now flip them upside down because that's going to make things easier, and set it down. In hindsight, that's going to make this a little easier to clean. There's some areas that are now easier to reach. We'll bring that over. For this activity, for the O-rings, I have a small container full of soapy water, just regular dish soap and soap, and that is what I'm going to use to lubricate the O-rings for installation. In this particular case, you can probably use fuel. However, I would not really recommend using grease or oil. I know a lot of people do use grease and oil on O-rings. Technically speaking, O-rings, if they are made out of real rubber, they will absorb oil and grease. What that can do is actually swell the O-ring, and now the fit is not good, and this can cause the O-ring to get cut and that kind of thing. So it really isn't advisable to use that kind of thing on an O-ring technically. A lot of rubber on car parts is not real rubber. It's neoprene. Take that advice with a grain of salt. However, when it comes to O-rings, I like using soapy water to help aid installation, and I really don't think you should be using anything else. That's just my 2 cents. I'm not saying if you use grease to do this, it's going to cause problems, but it technically can. So we have 3 parts to this gasket kit. We have the O-ring that goes around the injector on the inside of the rail, one for the outside. I think one of them's like technically just a damper, and then for the bottom towards where the injector is. I got this kit online. It is from this company, GB Remanufacturing. Very inexpensive on Parts Geek, I believe. Alright, number 1, pulling that bad boy. You can just pull it right out of the rail. Keep in mind that is an open fuel rail. Do not let junk fall in there. And I can see there is stuff that is already trying to fall in. That makes me nervous. To get these O-rings off, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to use just a pick, and I'm going to very gently just try and get underneath it there. Sometimes what works better actually is a small screwdriver, because you can just sort of lay the flat end underneath it. You just want to be really careful because you don't want to scratch the metal. That's really all we need to worry about. So once it's off, I'm just going to wipe it up. This O-ring, god damn, it's not going to come off in one piece. Okay, so that's hard as a rock, ladies and gentlemen. I just snapped it in half. So that would be why we're doing it. Although I don't think that particular one makes a great seal. Now this one is hard, and this one also kind of matters. So, god damn it, I just scratched. That's what I'm talking about. Be careful. I just scratched the metal, and now the car's not going to run ever again. God damn though. It is going to be tough getting these off though. Alright, I'm going to try something a little riskier and try and pull it off with pliers. See if I can maybe twist and move it. Okay, that's working actually. Be very careful when you're gripping it as well. You don't want to break that plastic piece off. It does look like we're working it. I can't begin to stress how careful I'm being. You don't want to slip and nick the injector ports or anything like that. Like, I am being so careful with these pliers, but I am also being very stern. So yeah, these O-rings are for sure not making a great seal. They're all coming out very loose. So I found for this O-ring that is between the blue-greenish part here, mine are really hard, so if I grab it and twist it, it'll just come apart. Alright, so there's a little groove around this ring, and I noticed that the OEM O-rings seem to fit in there. Now, that could just be a consequence of, like, over time they just filled that gap, but the newer ones are just a shape. They don't actually tuck in there. So that's just kind of an example of like how good OEM parts can be sometimes, unless it actually worked its way inside there from just time. Alright, set this aside, pull this bad boy up. Alright, so in all of these ports I couldn't really get very well. But I'm going to go in here, scrape out all this mud, and then get it nice and clean and ready for a good seal. It's probably worth noting that on the intake manifold there are these plastic spacers that can fall off pretty easily. Now that that is all set up, I think it's time to get our fuel rail back on. We want to make sure this is going the right direction. I guess these are offset, so there's only one way to put it on. So just make sure each and every individual injector goes into the little slot it is supposed to be in. Nice. And they all are positioned nicely. Okay. I know my bracket goes back on over here. We're going to bolt up the 4 bolts and we will call it done. And then I'll just double check the mating surfaces and make sure those are nice and clean. Alright, checking it out from the bottom side. We have the EGR pipe in. We should be done underneath the car, which is awesome. We can bring it back to a workable height instead of being above the ground. Our new EGR pipe is bolted to the back of the block, and the gasket and the pipe itself are fastened to the exhaust pipe downstairs. So we're all good. So now we're gonna keep working backwards. It's time that we talk connector repair. As you can see, this plastic connector did not survive. With old brittle plastic like this, it's very likely that when you go to depress the little clip, it just snaps and is completely destroyed, and you end up with something like this that isn't going to hold the tension. Well, you pretty much have 3 options when something like this happens. You can try and plug it in and hope for the best, which is not advisable, of course. Or you can replace the connector and the pigtail, or you can rebuild the terminal itself. A pigtail harness solution like this is probably the easiest and the most tempting for us to do. However, it's really not the most advisable. The main reason for that being the fact that you have to splice in to the original wiring harness and just splice the connector in. Now, people do this all the time with various connectors. If you're going to splice this connector in, you're left with pretty much two options. You can either solder it or use butt connectors, hopefully the ones with heat shrink, connect the wires that way. However, solder is really not advisable. There are people who are deathly adamant about not using solder on automotive stuff. The reason being is because these wires tend to move around a lot and they expand and contract from being hot all the time. And the risk of you having a cold solder joint, which is a broken solder joint that no longer makes an electrical connection, the odds of that are very high. The other option, a butt connector, has its own issues. It can act as an antenna and pick up electromagnetic interference, blah blah blah. Long story short, this is really not an advisable way to go about it. However, it is much better to do a terminal repair. Granted, this is totally more intimidating. It involves removing the wires out of the connector itself and putting them in a new shell. And if you do it thoroughly, we'll also be replacing the insulation as well as the tips of the wire. These are actually technically the terminals. Okay, so here is an example of the terminals that have been removed out of the connectors. As you can see, they're very similar to what we just saw over there, and the insulation is right there at the tip. But it isn't really different than something like a butt connector. It's just crimped onto the bare wire here. Once the wires are attached to the terminals, they will insert through this little hole, following the insulation to keep it nice and plugged, and it'll just go right in there, forming your connection. And then this little white tab closes in and locks the terminals in place. In order to remove it, I simply just grabbed a hold of it, just grabbed the tip of it like that, and wiggled it out with some needle nose pliers. Inside the connector, there's two tabs at the top there, okay? Those tabs hold on to the metal terminals themselves. So this part basically clips in to the plastic clip piece in there. And in order to release it, you have to stick a tool in there. What I use is just like a pick, and I just sort of depressed that clip. And if you do that correctly, this terminal should just slide right out. You should be left with something that looks a little like this. Just these two little things that slide out still attached to the wire. I will go through installing these and doing the whole thing, but I will say that in most cases, and what I'm going to do for the other 7 of these, I'm going to pull these terminals out, and then I'm just going to replace the plastic connector. Now, if it's making a crappy connection, or if it's corroded, or if it's rusty, or the wire's in bad shape or something, you can go through the whole terminal repair. In my case, they look pretty clean, they're in good shape, so all I really need is the plastic part. So to make it easier and to speed this whole thing up, I'm just going to do that piece. Alright, hands down, the most intimidating part of this, at least for myself, is finding the right crimp tool to properly crimp both of these tabs. So there's actually 2 things going on here. First of all, we have this rear crimp that's fairly obvious, okay? But then we also have this one that's a little closer to the terminal itself. It's kind of hard to see. This is where your wire goes. This rear crimp is going to go over the insulation, okay? In this particular case, it would look something like this, right? So there's our insulation, and then there's where the wire makes contact. So finding the proper tools to crimp those is going to be my challenge. And the reason that we don't use a pigtail like this is simply because it just introduces a new point of failure, and we want to repair our car properly. And so that's what we're doing. Unfortunately, the proper way is more difficult. You will find that oftentimes, just for the sake of peace of mind and doing it right the first time is the way to go. It's going to be probably the biggest challenge to uncrimp these. I'm just gonna... No way that's gonna work. Damn, I just realized I installed the EGR pipe before the starter, and now it's gonna be a bitch. Alright, let's see if I can do this without stabbing myself. Unfortunately, you may hit a point where you're not really going to be able to do it, so I just ended up cutting those terminals off. We should still have plenty of room to cut the wire back and do our thing, but it's less than ideal. So we have to put the insulation over the wire first, which of course is going to be a pain in the butt. And we want to make sure it's facing the right way. So we have the insulation over them, okay? Alright, so let's start with the one that appears that's going to be easier. This part is a super pain in the ass because we have to make sure that all of these little threads go into this tiny little hole. Now that we have the insulation on there and those bad boys on there, we're going to go ahead and plug in. We want to make sure that these are facing the right direction. So you can just double check by looking at where the tabs are on the inside. Stab it through. Push it in until you hear a click. Alright, and then we can just lock it in place like that. Give it a tug, make sure it's nice and tight. Very nice. Alright, now for the piece de la resistance, our bad boy starter motor. Being very careful, dropping her in. Don't want to knock any knock sensors. Nice, okay. Now let's see if we can get it threaded, eh? So after dropping one of those rear bolts and falling all the way down, dropping another bolt under the starter, spending like 15 minutes looking for the bolt I dropped and all that, the starter is almost plugged in. I'm starting to remember what hope felt like, you know? Alright, I'm going to clean up this ring terminal that goes on the starter just by sanding it.